We were just talking about apologetics beforehand. Apologetics is not apologizing, as you know. It's giving evidence for what you believe. It's actually not all that hard to show that Christianity is true, as we're going to see here in just a minute. But too often, the task is never undertaken. In fact, what happens when they go to college is they run into people with a philosophy like Francis Crick. Francis Crick helped co-discover the DNA molecule, and he wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. What's the astonishing hypothesis? Here's what he said. The astonishing hypothesis is that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. In other words, you are nothing but a molecular machine. You may think you have free will, but you really don't. You may think you're conscious, but that's just an illusion, because you are completely governed by the laws of physics. Every thought you have is the result of a previous natural cause over which you have no control. This is a very clear statement of what is known as atheistic materialism, and atheistic materialism dominates the academy today. Now, if Crick is right, obviously, Christianity's false, and there is no meaning to life. But I don't think it's all that difficult to show that Christianity's true. You only need to answer 4 questions in the affirmative to show that it's true. In other words, if you investigate these 4 questions, if you take an honest look at the evidence, I think you'll realize that the answer to these 4 questions is yes. And if the answer to these 4 questions is yes, then Christianity is true. What are the 4 questions? Here are the 4 questions. Why are these the 4? Does truth exist? Well, obviously, if the prevailing worldview is true, that there is no truth, or all truth is relative, or it's true for you but not for me, then quite obviously, the Bible can't be true. Of course, if there is no truth in any book written by an atheist, can't be true either. Right? We're going to deal with that question first. Second question, does God exist? Obviously, the Bible can't be true if there's no God. You can't have a word from God if there's no God, right? But I hope to show you tomorrow that there really is a theistic God. What do I mean by a theistic God? That's a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, moral, personal, intelligent creator who created all things and sustains all things, and whose every attribute is infinite. We're going to look at 3 arguments tomorrow for this being. Then we can get to question number 3, are miracles possible? Obviously, miracles are not possible if God doesn't exist. Now, a lot of people don't believe in miracles, but I hope to show you tomorrow that not only are miracles possible, but the greatest miracle in the Bible has already occurred, and we have scientific evidence for it. Then we can get to the key question, is the New Testament true? The New Testament doesn't have a prayer if there's no truth, no God, or no miracles. But if truth exists, if God exists, if miracles are possible, then we can see if the events of the New Testament really did occur. Particularly, the central event, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Did Jesus really die and rise from the dead? Because, ladies and gentlemen, if Jesus really rose from the dead, game over. Christianity's true. That's the central fact in Christianity, other than God exists. Now, can we really believe that? We're going to look at the evidence for that tomorrow. Now, some of you will look at that, wait a minute, Frank, do you believe the Old Testament's true? Yes. How? Well, look, if the New Testament's reliable, you get the Old Testament thrown in, right? Now, who's in the New Testament that can authenticate the Old Testament? Jesus. That's right. If Jesus really is God, as the New Testament documents claim he is, now that's a big if, but if he really is God, whatever God teaches is true. Jesus taught the entire Old Testament as the Word of God, so if the New Testament's reliable, you get the Old Testament thrown in. You with me on that? Now, the book goes into a lot more detail than these 4 questions. In fact, in the book, there's 12 points that show Christianity's true, but these are the essential 4. If you can remember truth, God, miracles, and the New Testament, you can show that what C.S. Lewis, your own C.S. Lewis, would call mere Christianity is true. Okay? Well, there's a lot of people that can't handle the truth. They're saying, you got your truth, I got my truth, there is no truth, all truth is relative. You've heard these claims, right? Well, in order to talk about this, we've got to talk about a law of logic. And the law of logic is known as the law of non-contradiction. And the law of non-contradiction helps us discover what is false. For example, the opposite ideas cannot be both true at the same time and in the same sense. For example, the earth is either round or it's not round, but it's not both, right? It's either round or it's not both. This basic law of logic just written into the furniture of the universe. I would argue the laws of logic are consistent with God's nature. They're immaterial laws that's just the way the reality is, okay? Now, some will say, okay, Frank, that's good, law of non-contradiction. What does this have to do with religion? Because you see, religion is just all about faith. It's not about fact, it's about faith. That's not true. In fact, let's take the most basic religious claim. Does God exist? And we'll take a couple of British gentlemen who debated recently on this. Oxford professor John Lennox and Oxford professor Richard Dawkins. As you know, John Lennox is a Christian who teaches at Oxford, who is a brilliant mathematician and philosopher. And Richard Dawkins is a brilliant zoologist who has written the book, The God Delusion. He thinks if you believe in God, you're deluded. And these men actually debated. Now, here's my question. Can both of these men be right about this particular topic? No, right? I mean, they both can't be right. If Dawkins is right, Lennox is wrong. If Lennox is right, Dawkins is wrong. But they're both not right and they're both not wrong. Right? Everyone with me so far? So, who's right? You guys are having trouble? It's Lennox, all right? I'm going to give you some evidence it's Lennox, but the only point I want to point out here is religious claims are claims about reality too. Now, I don't know if you've seen this debate. You got to watch the debate because it is quite a good debate, and Lennox, I thought, did very well. Now, the law of non-contradiction is undeniable. Even those who deny it use it. Suppose you go to a friend of yours and he makes a statement that's contradictory, and you say, hey, that violates the law of non-contradiction. It can't be true. And your friend just doesn't want to hear it. In fact, he says, you know what? I don't even believe in the law of non-contradiction. What would you say to him? He just contradicted himself. The great Dr. Sam Solomon's here, ladies and gentlemen. He is on it right away. That's exactly right. If somebody says, I don't believe in the law of non-contradiction, what I would say to them is, yes, you do. And they'll say, no, I don't. You say, yes, you do. No, I don't. Yes, you do. You're using it right now to contradict me. You see, you can't think a thought without the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction is to thinking what your eyes are to seeing. You can't see without eyes, and you can't think without the law of non-contradiction. As I said earlier, it's just part of the furniture of reality. In fact, there was a great Muslim philosopher many years ago, Avicenna, who had a great way of convincing people who denied the law of non-contradiction that they were wrong. Here's what Avicenna said. He said, anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. Right? Being beaten is not the same as not being beaten, and being burned is not the same as not being burned. You get the idea. Now, hold on to the law of non-contradiction. We're going to come back to it. I want to point out that all truth is absolute truth, or we might say objective truth. Something that is true for all persons at all times in all places. There are no relative truths. You say, wait a minute, Frank, I can think of a relative truth. Like what? Well, right now it's pretty warm here in London. I come to London and I think I'm in North Carolina. It's been warm the past couple of days. In fact, you might say, look, man, I feel warm right now. But the people in Antarctica, the 8 people that are there, they feel cold. That's relative. No, it's not relative at all. Why? It's absolutely true for all people at all times in all places that when referring to you right now, you feel warm, if in fact you really do. Because truth is what corresponds to its referent, or truth is what corresponds to reality. And it's absolutely true for all people at all times in all places that when referring to the people in Antarctica right now, they feel cold, if in fact they really do. Truth is truth. Now, if you try and say this in our society today, that all truth is absolute, people will claim that you are very judgmental. In fact, they will say things like this to you. They'll say, you know what, there is no truth. Or they might say, you can't know truth. Or they might say, all truth is relative. Or my favorite, it's true for you, but not for me. You've probably heard people say this. Well, Christianity's true for you, Buddhism's true for me. Or they might say, no one has the truth. You know, that's one thing I hate about you Christians. You're arrogant. You think you have the truth. Nobody has the truth. Or if they really get annoyed with you, they might say, you know what? You just ought not judge. Jesus said don't judge. Why are you judging, you hypocrites? Stop judging. Now, if you can't answer these claims, if you're a Christian, you can't say the Bible is true. And if you can't answer these claims and you're an atheist, you can't say Richard Dawkins' book is true. Right? So there's got to be a problem with these claims. What's the problem? Can anyone see the problem? What's the problem? What do all these claims violate? They all violate the law of non-contradiction. That's why we went through that. And here's what you need to do. This is your greatest tool in answering these objections. You want to apply the claim to itself. Apply the claim to itself, or we might say turn the claim on itself. Let me give you an example. If I were to say I can't speak a word in English, what would you say to me? You just use English to say it, right? It's what's called a self-defeating statement. If I say I can't speak a word in English, I'm using English. This is self-defeating. Or if I were to say, my brother is an only child. Or my parents had no kids that lived. Or if I were to say, all generalizations are false. Some of you will get that tomorrow. Or if I were to say, everything I say is a lie. Some of you will never get that one. All right? These are self-defeating statements. And if you can get good at identifying self-defeating statements, because you're going to see how many philosophies and statements that are out there in the culture that are supposed to refute what you believe actually are self-defeating. They can't be true. They violate the law of non-contradiction. So let's do a few of these. If someone were to ever come up to you and say, there is no truth, you should ask that person a question. What should the question be? Yeah, you're going to turn the claim on itself and say, hey, is that true? Is it true that there's no truth? Because if it's true that there's no truth, the claim there is no truth can't be true, but it claims to be true. Did I say that right? Can everyone see this is a self-defeating statement? Because they're claiming it's true, there's no truth. And what we're doing here is we're turning the claim on itself. And the real point I want to make here is, can everyone see that this statement shoots itself? That if somebody tries to say there's no truth, they're uttering a truth claim. So they're defeating themselves. How about this one? You hear this all the time. There's no such thing as absolute truth. If someone were to ever say this to you, what would you say to them? Yeah, is that absolute? If you want to have some fun, you can say, hey, are you absolutely sure? See, because that is actually an absolute truth claim. How about this one? You hear this a lot. This is my favorite one, by the way. It's true for you, but not for me. You know, Christianity's true for you, Buddhism's true for me. What do you say to that? So if somebody says it's true for you, but not for me, what would you say? You would say, hey, is that true for everybody? Is true for you, but not for me, true for everybody? Because if true for you, but not for me is true for everybody, then true for you, but not for me can't be true, because it's true for everybody. Did I say that right? I know that can give you intellectual constipation if you think about it long enough. But that's because it's self-defeating. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Actually, there's a more fun way of dealing with this. If somebody says it's true for you, but not for me, say, sure, go try that with your bank teller. Yeah, go down to the Bank of London here and say, look, I'd like 100,000 pounds out of my account. The bank teller looks at your account and says, I'm sorry, you only have 14 pounds in your account right now. It's very easy to get the money. You simply go, that's true for you, but not for me. Give me the 100 grand. You going to get the money? No, if it's true there's only 14 pounds in your account, that's true for all people at all times in all places when referring to your account at that time. It's just true. Now, by the way, I go to a lot of churches. I normally ask them, do you believe the Bible's true? And of course, most people will say yes, and then I'll ask them why. Do you know what answer I get more than any other, unfortunately? Because I have faith. Is that a good answer? Does your faith change whether or not the Bible's true? I mean, do you have to believe something to make it true? Do you have to believe in gravity to stay on the ground? Do people who don't believe in gravity float away? Hey, look, there's another one. Hey, if you believe, you'll come back. No, that's not the way it works. You say, why is the Bible always talking about faith then? Because there's two kinds of faith. There's belief that, and then there's belief in. Belief that is getting evidence that God exists, that Jesus rose from the dead, that the Bible is true. That's what we call apologetics. Again, it's getting evidence. But all the belief that in the world won't get your moral transgressions forgiven. Because you have to go from belief that to belief in. James, the half-brother of Jesus, who wrote a little document we have in the New Testament called James, said even the demons believe that God exists, but they tremble. Why? They know intellectually better than we do that God exists, but they don't trust in Him. There's a difference here. Belief that is intellectual. Belief in is intellectual and volitional. In other words, belief that is of the head. Belief in is not only of the head, it's of the heart. In fact, I was at a University of Michigan. Back a few years ago, I was debating an atheist by the name of Eddie Tabash, a brilliant attorney from Beverly Hills. And he asked me a question. We had the time to cross-examine one another, and his question to me was this. He said, Frank, my mother was a survivor of the Holocaust. She lived a life full of pain and suffering. Toward the end of her life, someone offered her the gospel, but she rejected it, and then she died. Is she in hell right now? I said, wow, that's a tough question to ask in front of a secular audience, thought to myself. But then I said, Eddie, I don't know where your mother is now. I don't know if she had a deathbed conversion or not. But if she didn't accept Christ before she died, then God is too loving to force her into heaven against her will. You see, because the assumption is everybody wants to go to heaven. That is not true. Who's in heaven? Jesus is in heaven. There have been people running from Jesus their entire lives. What's he going to do once everyone gets to the afterlife? All right, you're with me now. Get over here. You say, how would that be loving? Well, it wouldn't be. Well, what's all this business about hell then? I gave this illustration to the Michigan audience that night. In fact, I asked the ladies a question. Ladies, I'll ask you the same question. I'll just make believe you're the University of Michigan audience. Ladies, have you ever had a man pursue you whom you did not want to date? Some of you going, yeah, and he's sitting next to me right now. He will not leave me alone. In fact, whenever I ask that question, the ladies always giggle, and the men look at their shoes. They're going like, is she looking at me right now? Well, ladies, suppose this man pursues you. He pursues you. He continues to pursue you. He keeps asking you out. And you finally say to him, look, I like you, but only as a... Ladies, why don't you just stick the knife in and turn it? Every man has heard the dreaded friend rejection. Gentlemen, if you ever hear the dreaded friend rejection, move on. She's not interested. In fact, I have some shocking news for you. She doesn't even like you as a friend. Because if she did, she'd be interested, but she's not. Well, ladies, suppose this doesn't deter this guy. He continues to pursue, he continues to pursue, he continues to pursue. And he finally gets to the point where he says, look, I love you so much, I'm going to force you to love me. Run, screaming from the building. Ladies, can he do that? No, he can't force you to love him. Forced love is a contradiction. So if he ever says that, ladies, run away. Ladies, if he truly did love you, what would he do? He would leave you alone. That's exactly what God does for us. He sends us cards, letters, and flowers. He sends us creation. He sends us conscience. He sends us the Bible. He sends us Pastor Colin. He sends us Pastor Solomon. He sends us people who will speak into our lives the truth. He may even send you a dream or a vision. He may do a miracle of some kind. But if you keep saying, no, 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 I don't want you, then God will give you up to your own desires. He will leave you alone. Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 1. We suppress the truth to the point where God finally gives us up to our own desires. Now you might say, well, so God separates himself from us. What could be so bad about that? Well, imagine this. Every human being out there gets some of the common grace of God. His rain falls on the just and the unjust. Everybody experiences to a certain degree relationships, love, a hope for a future. We experience these things. In other words, everyone gets some of the common grace of God, whether they're a believer or not. But I want you to imagine a place where there is no love. There are no relationships. There is no hope for a future. There's just stone cold, narcissistic self-absorption. That is Washington. Oh, sorry. That is hell. You're cut off. You're cut off from the ultimate source of goodness. God is not going to force you into his presence. If you don't want him, he will leave you alone. In fact, C.S. Lewis famously said, in the end, there's only two kinds of people. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. So the question is, which kind are you? Which kind are you? Again, either Jesus rose from the dead or he didn't. It's not just true for you if he rose from the dead. It's true for everybody. Now, you have to accept it. You have to appropriate it. If you don't want God, he won't force you into his presence. But you have to accept it. Of course, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, you can believe it all you want. Not going to make it true. So it's true or false, regardless of what you believe about it. How about this? You might hear this a lot when you go to university. There's no truth in anything but science. Sounds so persuasive, doesn't it? Can anyone see the problem with it? Apply the claim to itself. Turn the claim on itself. What's the problem with it? Can anyone see it? What would you ask somebody who said this? Yes, you'd say, hey, is that a scientific truth? Can you go in the laboratory and prove that? No, that's a philosophical claim. That's a philosophical claim. You can't prove that by science. In fact, you can't do science without philosophy. You can't read the Bible without philosophy. You can't even read the newspaper without philosophy. In fact, philosophy undergirds everything we do. And I think on Sunday night we're going to talk a little bit about this. In fact, there's a whole chapter in the book, Stealing from God, that deals with this issue. In fact, we'll see Sunday night when we get into this how important philosophy is to science and theology. But to say that all truth comes from science is self-defeating, because that is not a scientific truth. It's a philosophical claim. Now, how many have heard of Immanuel Kant? Okay, you know what Immanuel Kant said? It's easy. Kant said, you can't know the real world. You got it? That's basically what Kant said. Why? Because there's a real world out there, but when the phenomena from the real world gets to your mind categorizes it in such a way that you can't know the real world, you can only know what your mind does to it. Leave it to a philosopher to come up with this, right? What's the problem with the claim? Can anyone see the problem? Apply the claim to itself. This is the interactive portion of the program. If Kant were here today and were to say, you can't know the real world, you would say, then how do you know that about the real world? Why can Kant know about the real world, but we can't? Do you see the problem? All modern philosophy goes through Kant. If you buy into Kant, you buy into modern philosophy, which means you buy into agnosticism, which means you can't really know anything. But it's self-defeating, because he says he knows he can't know. See the problem? How about this one? You should doubt everything. What would you say to somebody who said that? Yeah, you got it. Should I doubt that? You see, why are skeptics skeptical of everything but skepticism? You ever notice that? Skeptics are not skeptical of skepticism. They think it's true. Now, let me ask you guys a question. How many people in here have ever doubted what you believe? Whether you're a Christian or an atheist, you go, man, I don't even know if this is true. Yeah, I do. I doubt sometimes. I wrote a book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And sometimes I wake up and I go, is this stuff really true? You ever do that? Now, when I start thinking about my doubts, however, I realize that most of my doubts are emotional. They're not intellectual. In other words, it's because I'm having a bad day I'm doubting. It's not because I think the evidence for God isn't there or Jesus rose from the dead. In fact, the evidence is quite strong. What's changing is me. Sometimes I'm having a good day, everything looks fine. Next day, bad day, doesn't look good. Good day, everything's fine. Bad day, doesn't look good. What's changing, me or the evidence? I'm changing. Let me ask you another question about this. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Christianity's true. That's what we're doing here. We're going through arguments that it is. Let's just say it is. It really is. If you doubt it, does that change the fact that it's true? You ever hear people say, well, I lost my faith? Okay. Does that mean Christianity's no longer true because you lost your faith? No. If Christianity's true, you can lose your faith and it's still true. On the other hand, if it's not true, you can have all the faith you want. If it's not true, it's not true. So instead of concentrating on yourself, going up and down like this, you ought to concentrate on the evidence. Because your psychological state and my psychological state does not affect whether or not God exists or Jesus rose from the dead. It's the evidence that shows us whether or not he did. In fact, a friend of mine, Greg Kokel, I don't know if you ever heard of him, he's wrote a great book called Tactics. And he doubts sometimes. He says, in fact, before I have my first cup of coffee in the morning, I'm an atheist. After I have my first cup, I'm a Jehovah's Witness. And by the time I have my second cup, I'm back to being a Christian again. Right? What's changed? The evidence? No, he has changed. The evidence doesn't change. We go up and down. Now, by the way, doubts can be a good thing. Why? Why can they be a good thing? Because it forces you to get answers. It forces you to dive in and to learn, and that's a good thing. Now, you can go through all this. Oh, by the way, skeptics, for example, atheists, they'll say, well, to Christians, they'll say, you Christians, you have the burden of proof. If you're going to say God exists and Jesus rose from the dead, then you've got to give evidence. We do. But atheists act like they don't have any burden of evidence, or any burden of proof, I should say. They say they just lack a belief. That's not the definition of atheism. They just lack a belief. Because if that's the definition of atheism, then this remote is an atheist. Right? It lacks a belief in God, right? Maybe I should get it some evidence. This computer is an atheist by that definition. This floor, any inanimate object, is an atheist by that definition. No, an atheist is someone who thinks the evidence shows there is no God. And I've noticed that atheists don't just lack a belief in God. They come up with all sorts of explanations to explain why the universe is the way it is. They'll say it's quantum theory. They'll say it's evolution. They'll say there are multiple universes out there. They'll say that materialism's true. They don't lack a belief in any of those things. They have positive beliefs that those things are true. So if you're ever having a discussion with somebody on that, you ought to say, well, what evidence do you have that those things are true? Right? See, he who is a skeptic in one set of beliefs, Christianity, is a true believer in another set of beliefs, materialism. By saying you have the burden of proof alone. No, they do as well. Now, here's the granddaddy self-defeating statement of them all that you're going to hear. You ought not judge. Right? You hear this all the time. Jesus said, don't judge. Why are you judging, you hypocrites? Now, before we get to Jesus, let me just ask you a question. What's the problem with the claim? Can anyone see it? Yes, if somebody says you ought not judge, you ought to say, isn't that a judgment? Or you might say, then why are you judging me for judging? See, this is a judgment. You ever notice that? Now, by the way, what did Jesus say about judging? Did he just say, judge not, and that was it? No, he said, judge not, lest you be judged. By the same standard you judge others, you'll be judged by that standard. So before you try and take the speck out of your brother's eye, take the log out of your own eye first, then you'll be better able to help your brother. Is Jesus telling us not to judge here? No, he's telling us to take the speck out of our brother's eye. That involves making a judgment. He's simply saying, get that problem out of your life first so you can better help your brother. So this is not a command not to judge. It is a command on how to judge. In other words, don't judge hypocritically. If you've got that problem, fix it first. In fact, you could say it this way. Jesus is basically saying, judge yourself first before you judge somebody else. Square your own life away first before you go after other people. That seems like pretty good advice, don't you? In fact, Jesus said in John 7:24, he said, stop judging by mere appearances and make a right judgment. Do you notice that everybody has to make judgments? It's not just Christians who do. Muslims make judgments. Hindus make judgments. Agnostics make judgments. There's not enough evidence. That's a judgment. Atheists make judgments. If you're a Christian, they're judging you as being wrong. They think the Bible's not true. God doesn't exist. Those are judgments. The question isn't whether or not you can make judgments. The question is, are your judgments true? By the way, I've noticed one other thing about judging. You ever notice that when you compliment somebody, which is a judgment, nobody gets upset? Like if I were to say to Pastor Colin, what a wonderful pastor you are. You're doing some great work here in London and all around the world. You're amazing. You think he's going to go, who do you think you are? Are you judging me? You think you're worse than me? No, he's never going to say that, right? Because I've noticed that people don't really have a problem with judging. They just have a problem with judgments they don't like. As Augustine said, we love the truth when it enlightens us. We hate the truth when it convicts us. Jesus said we love darkness rather than light. If somebody tries to expose your evil deeds, you're going to resist that. We could spend a lot more time on this, but we don't have time on these self-defeating statements. Let me just do one more, because you hear this all the time. Well, actually, two more. People will say, all truth depends on your perspective. What would you say if somebody said that? Apply the claim to itself. If somebody says all truth depends on your perspective, you should say, does that truth depend on your perspective? Then they might say, oh, you're just playing word games with me. What would you say to that? Is that a word game? Why is it when I say it, it's a word game? When you say it, it's logic. What is the truth about truth? Contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not possible. I mean, you can believe everything's true, but everything can't be true. You can believe the earth is flat if you want. That's not going to make it flat. And objective truths can't be denied without being affirmed. Suppose somebody says there are no objective truths. What should you say to them? You should say, is that an objective truth? If they say yes, they've just defeated their own argument. If they say no, then you might say to them, well, why should I believe it then? If it's just your subjective opinion, it's not really true, it doesn't correspond to reality, why should I believe it? You see, you can't get away from objective truth. Actually, you can get away from it temporarily. How do you do that? You suppress it. You suppress the truth because you want to go your own way. Paul, again, talks about this in Romans 1, that we suppress the truth and unrighteousness to do our own thing. In fact, here's a question I ask atheists on college campuses. I do a lot of college campuses in America. Doing a presentation like this, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And during the Q&A, where we have microphones set up, if an atheist gets up to the microphone and expresses a little bit of hostility, I'll ask this question. And I think this is the one question you should ask somebody who's not a Christian. Here's the question. If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? I've had atheists stand at the microphone in front of hundreds of people and say, no! No? Wait, you claim to be an atheist, a beacon of reason. Never mind if atheism's true, reason doesn't exist, because if atheism's true and we're just molecular machines, like Francis Crick said, If we're just moist robots, we're not really reasoning anyway, we're just reacting. But let's leave that aside. I ask you, if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian? How's that reasonable? How's that rational? It's not. The problem isn't here. The problem's here. They don't want it to be true. In fact, I ask this question of all audiences I speak to now. I'm going to ask you guys this question. For those of you who are Christians in here, let me ask you a question. I want you to think of somebody that you know who's not a Christian that you'd like to be a Christian. Everyone have somebody right now? Got somebody? Okay, here's the question. Is the person you're thinking of right now on a relentless pursuit of truth? Or are they apathetic or even hostile to the Christian faith? How many say the person I'm thinking of is on a relentless pursuit of truth? They want to know it. Nobody. How many people say, maybe one, how many people say the person I'm thinking of is apathetic or even hostile? Look at this. The problem for most people is not intellectual, it's volitional. They don't want it to be true because if it's true, that is terrifying. Why is it terrifying? Because that means they might have to change something they don't want to change. They might have to start doing something they don't want to start doing, or stop doing something they don't want to stop doing. In fact, I've asked some of the atheists I've debated, what's the real issue? And some of them have admitted the issue. In fact, the real issue is not evidence. The elephant in the room is not evidence. The elephant in the room is morality and accountability. People don't want it. In fact, you're a sophisticated audience in here. I know this is politically incorrect to say, but that's okay. I'm going back to America soon. The elephant in the room, if you want to drill down further, is sex. That's the elephant in the room. In America, the things we argue over culturally, all related to sex. Abortion, same-sex marriage, transgenderism, government pays for your contraception, government pays for your abortion. Now we're arguing over what bathrooms to use. You notice any common thread running through those things? All related to sex. That's the new religion in America. I don't know if it is here in the UK, but that's the new religion. It's an old religion resurrected. Look, if there is no God, some people say, what else is there? My identity comes from sex. And if the Christian worldview is true, God has narrowed sex for our own good to a man and a woman forever in matrimony. Not for his benefit. He doesn't get anything out of it. He's infinite. It's for our benefit. But people don't want that. So ask the question, if it were true, would you become a Christian? Now, atheists rightfully will turn that question back on you and say, well, if atheism were true, would you become an atheist? And my answer is yes, but there's no way to show it's true. In fact, we'll talk about that Sunday night. Atheism has made reason and science impossible. So just remember, the elephant in the room isn't always evidence. Now, for some people it is. I came to faith through evidence because I wanted to know. I wanted to know if it was true. So I read apologetic books. Evidence Demands a Verdict, More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell. That's how I got into this whole thing. I came to faith through apologetics. But for many people, they don't want the truth. They want to suppress the truth. But that's okay. If you ask that person you're thinking of that question and they say, no, I wouldn't become a Christian, or they hesitate, continue to love them. Evidence is important, but remember, it's not always about the evidence. What evidence does is it clears away objections that allows you to see the cross. That's what we're really trying to do here. In fact, it was Pascal who said this: people almost invariably arrive at their beliefs not on the basis of proof, but on the basis of what they find attractive. In fact, Pastor Colin and I were talking before, a friend of his changed religions three times. And Pastor Colin's trying to say, well, is this about truth? No, it wasn't about truth for him at all. It was just about what he liked. Gee, I think I'll try Buddhism for a while. Now I'll try Islam for a while. That didn't work. Let me go back to secularism. Colin's hoping he may get to Christianity one of these days, right? It's all about what they like, what they find attractive. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, if we're Christians in here, we've got to ask ourselves, where did that slide go? No, we've got to ask ourselves, are we doing this? Are we just Christians because we find it attractive? We find it attractive there's a God who looks over us, and when we die, we're going to be with him and our loved ones. Or is it really true? Now, thankfully, you can be right about something without knowing why. Right? In fact, the witness of the Holy Spirit can tell you it's true. There's a difference between knowing Christianity is true and showing it's true. The witness of the Holy Spirit can help you know it's true, but it can't help you show it's true because the other person can't see the witness of the Holy Spirit. Only you can. So, point one is, does truth exist? If our reasoning has been good here, what does this mean? It means that relativism and postmodernism are false. Why? They say it's true, there's no truth. Or they say it's true, all truth is relative. So the Bible could be true, but so could atheism, right? Richard Dawkins might be right at this point. In order to figure out who's right, we got to move on to the next question. And that next question is, does God exist? But we can't move on to that until tomorrow.